Hi everyone, Will here with History in Bits. Welcome to part 1 of my series on Nintendo's boxing franchise PunchOut. In this series, we're going to take a look at the history of PunchOut from its origins in arcades back in the 80s all the way up to its last release in 2008 on the Wii. For today's video, part 1, we're going to focus on the origin of PunchOut and the original 2 arcade games, PunchOut and Super PunchOut. So let's go ahead and jump right in. The first PunchOut game was released in 1984, but the story of PunchOut actually begins with the original arcade release of Donkey Kong. And as you can imagine, the journey from a game about jumping over barrels to a boxing game isn't exactly a simple point A to point B trip, so let's figure out how exactly that happened. During Donkey Kong's peak in popularity in the early 80s, Nintendo bought pretty much every arcade monitor they could get their hands on to meet demand. Eventually, they realized they had purchased way too many and they needed to make new games to use all of this excess stock and keep it from collecting dust in the warehouse. The lead developer for the game was Shinya Takada, who many consider to be Nintendo's first game developer due to his work on the horse racing game EVR Race that released in 1975. Takada is one of the few people who can say that they really changed the course of gaming several times in their career. He's known mainly for hardware innovations such as his invention of battery backup technology, which allowed NES games to have saves. He created the first ever analog stick, and he played a big role in developing and designing the Wii, the Wii U, and much more. Also brought in on the project was one of the most legendary names in video games, Shigeru Miyamoto, who could easily be called the most beloved video game developer of all time. Takada first explored the idea of using new technology to make a racing game. He and Miyamoto wanted to make it a big game that used 2 monitors side by side, which would also help get rid of the excess stock of monitors. The most impressive arcade tech at the time was Laserdisc, but Nintendo didn't want to dive into Laserdisc games quite yet due to their high maintenance cost. So instead, they wanted to reproduce as much of that tech as they could using semiconductors and microchips in their machines. One of the biggest innovations at the time was the ability to have images zoom in and out on the screen. They were able to reproduce this to an extent without using Laserdisc, but they could only use it at one image on a time. This of course was not enough for a racing game in which multiple vehicles would be going by, so they needed a new idea. Miyamoto suggested that since they were limited to only one image that could zoom in and out on the screen, perhaps that one image could be a person, and this eventually led to the idea of a boxing game, and PunchOut was born. Nintendo still liked the idea of using 2 monitors, but they couldn't quite figure out how to make it work in a boxing game. Eventually, they decided they would stack the monitors vertically instead of side by side. They used the top monitor to be the scoreboard, basically like the big scoreboards and banners you see over boxing matches that have, portraits of the fighters, how much time is left, what round it's in, all that kind of thing. They put on the top screen and also put in, some of the meters needed for actually playing the game. And then on the bottom screen was all of the gameplay and the characters, the ring, the crowd, everything that you really needed for the game. Takada directed the project, Miyamoto designed the ridiculous characters, and Koji Kondo was brought on to handle the sound and music. In fact, PunchOut is the first game that Koji Kondo is credited to have worked on, which makes the game historic in even more ways. Kondo would go on to create some of the most memorable music in all of gaming, including the original Super Mario Bros. And Legend of Zelda soundtracks. Though he would go on to do these great things, the music and sound for the first PunchOut game was mostly forgettable, and the game's entire soundtrack was only about 2 minutes long. In fact, the sound is the one thing that hinders my personal enjoyment of the game, because for some reason, they thought it was a good idea to have the announcer yell every single time they hit a button what type of punch the player is throwing. I guess having voiceover in a game at the time was pretty cool, but I feel like there must have been some kind of better use than to just have this constantly through the entire game. But anyway, that's my own personal rant. We're going to move on. Miyamoto designed the opponents, but he had professional artists turn his drawings into the pixel art that's found in the final game. Miyamoto did, however, animate the crowd and referee himself, which is why, if you look closely, you'll find both Mario and Donkey Kong in the audience. He also drew the player character, who was made of a wireframe, so that the player can see through his character and actually see the opponent on the other side, since it's from behind the back of the main character. So the game came out in 1984, and it immediately became a popular coin-eating machine. Audiences loved the addictive gameplay and cartoon style. The gameplay progressed by the player climbing the ranks of the World Video Boxing Association and fighting against increasingly difficult opponents until the player reached Mr. Sandman in the championship match. There were only 6 opponents in the game, but at the time it was more than enough to keep players happy. Based on the success of PunchOut, Nintendo wanted to make a sequel even though the first game had only been out for a short period of time. Takeda felt they had done everything they could with boxing at the time, so to differentiate it from the first, he had to get creative. Miyamoto was still involved in development, but mainly just provided support. It seems that Takeda was the main creative force in the game, which led to some very interesting design decisions for the game. He decided that the best way to differentiate the new game, which they were now calling Super Punch-Out, from the original was to have opponents play outside of the rules of boxing. This led to opponents like Dragon Chan, whose special move was a martial arts kick despite, being in a boxing match. In fact, Takeda seriously debated with other developers whether or not weapons should be included in the game. Eventually, they decided to just go with the illegal boxing moves and no weapons, but it's pretty crazy to think about having weapons in a Nintendo boxing game, right? Super Punch-Out also debuted Vodka Drunkinsky, who's possibly the most famous character in the Punch-Out series, better known as Soda Popinski, which is what they changed his name to when the games went on home consoles, but we'll talk more about that later. The biggest noticeable gameplay difference was the ability to duck, which was quicker than dodging a punch. The player's character was still a wireframe. The graphics and music were similar, though they were improved over the original despite Koji Kondo no longer being involved in sound development. Super Punch-Out was released in 1984, yes, that is the same year as the original Punch-Out, and it was about as successful as Punch-Out had been. It didn't set the world on fire, but it certainly took its fair share of quarters from arcade goers. Okay, so one last game I want to mention before we finish up this first episode is Punch-Out was also released as a really basic Micro versus System game, which was a series of the Game & Watch little handheld LCD games that Nintendo made for this time period. It came out in Japan in 1984 around the same time as these arcade games, which is why I want to bring it up now. When it came out in Japan, it was under the name Boxing. It wasn't called Punch-Out until it was released in North America a few years later, closer to the release of Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. Anyway, thanks everyone for watching. Hope you found this video entertaining and informative. I plan to have 2 more parts in this series coming up in the next few weeks. The second part is going to be on the NES and SNES games, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out and Super Punch-Out. And then the third part will be on all of the spin-offs and knockoffs, whatever, and of course the Wii game that came out back in 2008. So again, thank you for watching. Have a great day.